Thank you. We do face some challenges in this country that I hope people in this room will begin to think about and engage in a more direct and meaningful way. As was indicated, we're in a part of the world where things have changed really radically over the last 40 years. In 1972, we had a prison population in America of 300,000. Today, our prison population is 2.3 million. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated. We have 6 million people on probation and parole. In the United States today, there are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when these people apply for loans or try to get a job, they are disfavored by that arrest history. The percentage of women going to prison has increased 640% in the last 20 years. 70% of these women are single parents with minor children. And when they go to prison, their children get displaced. There are collateral consequences to mass incarceration that are also devastating. We had 80,000 people come to Selma this past March to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the march to Montgomery. The president came, members of Congress came, and very few people who came to Selma had any idea that today in Alabama, 31% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote as a result of a criminal conviction. There are 10 states where the levels of disenfranchisement are actually higher than at any moment since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. We're actually projecting there are counties in my state of Alabama where disenfranchisement will rival the levels of disenfranchisement at the time the Voting Rights Act was passed. The percentage of poverty, children in poverty, has increased in the African American community by 39% since the year 2000. And we have this new data that is the most troubling for me. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. 1 in 3. That was not true in the 20th century. That was not true in the 19th century. It became true in the 21st century. Now, I could actually give similar data to dramatize similar problems when it comes to homelessness, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to hunger, when it comes to education, when it comes to adversity and all of these other phenomena. And I don't really want to talk about these problems. I want to talk about the solutions, because I actually believe there are 4 things that we can do to not only change these trends, to disrupt this phenomenon of over-incarceration, but I believe these 4 things will actually help us change the world. And I'm really serious about that. I think we can create more justice in the world. I think we can create more compassion in the world. I think we can create better relationships with one another in the world. I think we can decrease poverty in the world. But we've got to talk about these 4 things. The first is proximity. I am persuaded that we cannot change the world, that you can't even be a good citizen. You can't be good stewards of the money and the resources that you have. You can't be responsible influencers until you understand the importance of getting proximate to problems in our world. I'm persuaded that proximity is necessary because proximity teaches you things that you can't learn from a distance. We have too many problem solvers and too many politicians trying to solve problems in education and healthcare and over-incarceration, and their problems and their solutions aren't working because they're too distant. When you get proximate to problems, you see things and you hear nuances and details that you cannot see from a distance. Technologists, innovators know that to actually solve a problem, to create a breakthrough, you've got to get close and inside of that problem, and proximity is how many of you have succeeded. The same recipe exists for social justice. We've got to get close to the part of our community where there's suffering, where there's inequality. We've all been taught indirectly that if there's a problem neighborhood, you want to stay away. If there's a problem school district, you don't want to go there. If there are people where there's adversity and conflict and violence, you have to stay far from that. We've been taught to actually keep our distance from problems. And I'm here to say if we want to really change the world, we've got to get close. Proximity is important. I'm a product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in the rural South where black children could not go to the public schools. I lived in a community where there were no high schools for black kids. My dad, when he was a teenager, couldn't go to high school because there were no high schools for black children. Lawyers came into our community when I was a little boy, and they made them open up the public schools. And but for their intervention, I wouldn't be standing here. But because they chose to get proximate, I got to go to high school. I graduated high school. I went to college, had a great time in college. I was active in music. I was active in sports. I was a philosophy major. I really loved college, to be honest. When I was in my 3rd or 4th year of college, I realized that nothing was actually going to get as good as this, so I decided I wanted to stay in college forever. And as a philosophy major, I thought that maybe somehow I could work something out, and I would sometimes say to my friends, I'd say, I'm going out on the hillside to think some deep thoughts because I'm a philosophy major. And I realize now that my friends probably thought I was saying I was going out on the hillside to get high or to do something illegal, but I wasn't. I would actually go out there and think what I thought were these great deep thoughts. And one day I was out there, and somebody came up to me and said, you're a philosophy major and you're a senior. What are you going to do after you graduate? And I heard this as a very hostile question because I realized for the first time nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. And I panicked because I didn't know what I'm sure all of you knew. Nobody in my family had graduated from college. I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work, and if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science to get into graduate school. That was very intimidating to me, so I kept looking around, and to be honest, that's how I found law school. It was very clear to me that you don't need to know anything to go to law school. And so I signed up for that and was very disillusioned because nobody was talking about racial inequality or poverty. And it was only when I got proximate that I began to see the potential for doing something. I tried to reconcile myself to a career as a lawyer that I knew was not going to be affirming. But when I got proximate to children being prosecuted as adults, it changed things. I worked on a case some years ago involving a 14-year-old boy who lived in a household where his mom was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. There was lots of adversity in this home. And this boy's mother had a boyfriend who, when he would start drinking, would get violent. And one day the man had been drinking, he came home, he walked into the kitchen, he called the boy's mother into the kitchen. He didn't say anything, he just walked up to her and punched her in the face. She fell, she hit her head, she was knocked unconscious, she was on the floor bleeding. The little boy ran in to try to help his mother recover. He tried to get her to wake up, he tried to get her to respond, but she wouldn't. And after 10 minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought she was. So the little boy got up and he went into the bedroom where the man had gone inside and fallen asleep. And this little boy walked over to a dresser drawer where he knew this man kept a handgun. He opened the drawer, he pulled the gun out, he walked over to where the man was sleeping, and he pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring, and when the man stopped snoring, this little boy pulled the trigger, shot the man in the head. The man died almost instantly. Now, this little boy was very small for his age. He'd never been in trouble before. He was about 5 feet tall. He weighed less than 100 pounds. But he had no prior juvenile adjudications. He was actually a decent student, and he might have been tried as an adult, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. They certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in the adult jail. Today, we have some 10,000 children under the age of 17 in adult jails and prisons. He'd been there for 3 days before his grandmother called me and asked me to get involved, and I said I would, and I went to the jail, and this little boy came out, and I started my interview, but no matter what I asked him, he wouldn't say a word. He just kept staring at the wall. And finally, I put my pen down, and I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. The little boy wouldn't say anything. I got up, I walked around the table, I pulled my chair close to him, I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And he just kept staring at the wall. Couldn't figure out what to do. And at some point, I decided to just lean on him. I don't even know why, but I leaned on him, and when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him, and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. And that's when this little boy started crying. And through his tears, he began talking to me, not about what happened with his mom, not about what happened with the man, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night he'd been raped by several people. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. I said, look, I'm going to get you out of here. And he begged me not to go. I never will forget. He grabbed my arm and said, please don't go. I said, no, I'm going to get you out of here. And I left that jail, and the question I had in my mind is, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We are. We're living in a country where we've allowed a narrative to emerge that some children aren't children. We're living in a country where we have created so much distance from the poor and the abused and the marginalized that their victimization is something we don't even recognize. And I believe we have to change that. We have to get proximate. Proximity is important because we'll understand the solutions to problems, but it's important because it will also change us. When you get close to problems like that, when you hold kids like that, when you go into communities where there's suffering and despair and hopelessness, it will change you. And I think it will change you in ways that are important. You'll learn that you have power that you didn't think you had. That how sometimes just being a witness in a place of despair can be transformative. Proximity is essential if we want to change the world. Second thing, we have to change the narrative. I don't think we can actually problem solve by understanding how problems get created. We have to change the narratives that sustain these problems. I believe we should cut the prison population in this country by 50% in the next 8 years, and I think we can do it. We have 1 million people in jails and prisons serving time for drug possession. I've represented people serving life in prison without parole for simple possession of marijuana. Hundreds of thousands of people in our jails and prisons who are not a threat to public safety for simple drug possession and other low-level nonviolent crimes. We can bring down the prison population, but we will not do that if we don't change the narrative that has sustained it. For the last 40 years, our politicians have been competing with each other over who can be the toughest on crime, and it's this narrative of fear and anger that is the problem. And I will tell you, any country, any society that is motivated to do policy work, to do governance through fear and anger is a society that will abuse other beings. It's how human rights problems created. It's how oppression is created. It's how genocide is created. And the narrative of fear and anger has to change. We can't be a part of those narratives when they come to us. We have to resist them. I think we have to change the narrative about race. I think we are all burdened by the legacy of racial inequality that has never been addressed. We're all infected by this disease, this narrative of racial difference that our parents and our grandparents did not address. We were silent when we should have been speaking. And because of that, it bothers and it burdens all of us. We all see the world through this lens. And we're not going to get on the other side of that by pretending it doesn't exist. We have to have a conversation we've never had. I actually think we need to talk about slavery in America because we never talked about it. I don't think the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude and forced labor. I don't think the great evil of American slavery was the way we made people work in fields. I think the great evil of American slavery was the narrative of racial difference we created to legitimate it. It was the ideology of white supremacy that we made up to make ourselves feel comfortable with slavery. Slavery existed all over the world, but most countries with societies with slaves, we became something unique. We became a slave society. We wanted to feel good while we owned other human beings, and this ideology of white supremacy, this narrative of racial difference, that was the great evil. And the 13th Amendment doesn't deal with that evil. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't talk about that, and that's why I've argued that I don't believe slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of racial terror and lynching. We've just issued a report documenting thousands of lynchings in the American South. The demographic geography of this country was shaped by this era of racial terror. Older people come up to me sometimes, they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. And we don't appreciate how it shaped our world. You know, you've got African Americans in Phoenix, in Los Angeles, in Oakland, in Seattle, in Cleveland, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Boston, in New York. And what we don't think about is that the black people, the African Americans that are in these communities, did not go to those communities as immigrants looking for new opportunities. They came to these communities as refugees and exiles from terror. And we haven't talked about it. Even when we talk about civil rights, I get worried because I think we're too celebratory. We're not talking about the hard parts created by the decades of segregation. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it sounds to me like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on the bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we just changed all these laws. And if that was our history, I mean, we'd be a great country, but that's not our history. Our history is that for decades, we humiliated people of color. For decades, we burdened and we battered and we excluded people. For decades, we told people that you're not good enough to go to school with the rest of us. You're not good enough to vote. And that narrative has not been confronted. I believe we need truth and reconciliation in this country. We have to talk more honestly about what this legacy has done. I live in the American South, which is littered with the iconography of a false narrative. In my state of Alabama, we celebrate Jefferson Davis's birthday as a state holiday. Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. We don't even have Martin Luther King Day. It's Martin Luther King/Robert E. Lee Day. And this narrative has to change. I believe on the other side of this narrative, there's freedom. There's something better than what we're experiencing. In South Africa, there was a recognition that after apartheid, there had to be truth and reconciliation. If you go to Rwanda, people will tell you that they won't recover from the genocide without truth and reconciliation. In Germany, You go to Berlin, you can't go 100 meters without seeing a marker or a stone that's been placed at the home of a Jewish family that was abducted and taken to the camps. The Germans want you to go to the camps and reflect soberly on the history of the Holocaust. In this country, we do the opposite. You start talking about race and people get nervous. You start talking about racial justice, people are looking for exits, and that has to change. We want to put markers at every site where lynching took place. We want to create a consciousness that pushes us past this narrative and the presumption of dangerousness and guilt that it's created. Changing the narrative is important if we want to change the world. Third thing, you can't do this work without being hopeful. And the third thing I believe we have to do is protect our hopefulness about what we can do. You see, I'm persuaded that injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. And when you begin to think that you cannot do anything about these income disparities, about income inequality, about health outcomes that are bad, about all of these challenges that you're seeing in communities across this country, then we are not going to make progress. Your hope is important. And I am persuaded that in technology and innovation, you only succeed when you believe things you have not seen. It doesn't work any other way. Most of you have done extraordinary things because you were hopeful enough to believe that the limits that had been previously defined are not the limits that ought to define us. Hope is what gets you to stand up when other people are saying, sit down. Hope is what gets you to speak when other people are saying, be quiet. And it's important that we protect our hopefulness. I don't know what makes you hopeless. I know what makes me hopeless. And I have to protect against what makes me hopeless. And I'm probably living in the worst place in America. I live in Alabama. It's probably the worst state for me to live in because I am sometimes provoked by the way we haven't dealt honestly with our history. I don't like it when people talk about the good old days of the 40s and 50s. I don't like it when we romanticize that part of our era and our history that was defined by enslavement and terrorism. I don't like the Confederate flags. I don't like the imagery of the Old South. It provokes me. I was going to a prison to see a client, and I parked my car in the prison. There was a truck out there, and this truck was like a shrine to the Old South. You see this a lot in my state. This truck had all of these bumper stickers, it had these flags, it had the gun rack, it had all of this imagery. And I was really challenged by it because there were bumper stickers on this truck I'd actually never seen before. One of the bumper stickers read, quote, "If I'd known it was going to be like this, I'd have picked my own cotton." Hadn't seen that one before. And I was really challenged by it. I went up to the door, and there was a white guard at the door. When I got there, this man said to me, I said, "Hi, my name is Bryan Stevenson. I'm here for a legal visit." And the man said, "You're not a lawyer." I said, "No, yes, sir, I am. I've been to this prison before." He said, "I don't believe you're a lawyer. Where's your bar card?" And he made me go get my bar card, which I was insulted by. But I did. I got it, and I brought it back to him. I said, "Here's my bar card." He said, "Well, you've got a bar card, but you're still going to get in the bathroom. I'm going to give you a strip search." I said, "No, sir, lawyers don't get strip search coming into this prison." He said, "Well, you're going to get in that bathroom." Couldn't get anybody to help me. So I subjected myself to this humiliating strip search. I went in the bathroom, came back out, was trying to recover some dignity. I said, "Look, I want to see my client now." He said, "Well, you've got to go back there and sign the book." I said, "Lawyers don't have to sign that book. Get back there and sign the book." So I did. And finally, he was letting me into the prison. I was about to walk inside, and he grabbed me by the arm. He said, "Hey, did you see that truck out there with all those bumper stickers and flags?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that truck." He said, "I want you to know something." He said, "That's my truck." Really antagonized me. I went into the prison. The client came out. First time I'd ever met this man. He was a young African-American man. And the client came out, and the first thing he did was sit down and say to me, quote, "Did you bring me a chocolate milkshake?" And I thought to myself, this is the strangest day I've had in a really long time. I said, "No, I didn't bring you a chocolate milkshake. I'm your lawyer. I'm here to represent you." And I realized he was hung up on this milkshake. He was very disabled, a lifetime of abuse, was in 29 foster homes by the time he was 10 years old, a schizophrenia, psychosis. In the midst of a psychotic episode, he committed a brutal crime. We started working on the case. I got some great experts involved, and every time I saw this man, I had to tell him I couldn't bring him a milkshake just to get him to pay attention. And it finally was time to go to court about 3 months after I'd met him, and we were there for a hearing. And I had some great experts. I felt good about the case. And I was about ready to start the case when I looked out of the corner of my eye, and there was that guard who had dealt with me so badly sitting in the corner, just staring at me. I said I wasn't going to let him distract him. I put on our case. We had 3 good days in court. I felt good. About a month later, I went back to the prison to go see my client. I parked my car. I'm walking inside, and what do I see but that truck in the parking lot? And I just didn't feel like dealing with it that day. And I decided to come back another day. Drive 2 hours to get there. I'll just come back another day. I was walking back to my car, and I started hearing that song they used to sing during the Civil Rights Movement. They used to sing this song, "Can't let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around." And I realized I wasn't supposed to turn around. So I got my bar card. I said, I'm just going to go deal with this guy. And I walked up to the door, and sure enough, there was the officer. I said, hi, I'm here for a legal visit. The man cut me off. He said, hello, Mr. Stevenson. How are you? I said, I'm fine. I said, I'll go in the bathroom and get ready for your search. He said, oh, no, Mr. Stevenson, we're not going to do that today. Threw me. I said, I'll go back here and sign the book. He said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, I saw you coming, and I signed you in. Could not make sense of it. He walked me over to the door. I was trying to figure out what was going on. We got in front of the door, and I was watching this man. And when he got in front of the door, he tried to unlock it, but his hand started shaking so badly he could not get the key in the lock. And I stood there staring at him, and finally he got the key in the lock. And he turned around, he looked up at me. His face was bright red. I said, Mr. Stevenson, there's something I've got to say to you. I said, what's that? He said, well, I was in that courtroom, and I was listening. He said, I want you to know that I grew up in the foster care system, too. I had it really bad. He said, I'm a really angry person, but I learned something in that courtroom. He said, I've been thinking about this, and there's something I need to tell you. And he looked at me and says, I want you to know I think what you're doing is a good thing. And then that guy said to me, I hope you keep fighting for justice. I would have never imagined it possible. Never imagined it. I said, thank you for that. That means the world to me. He said, can I please shake your hand? I shook his hand. I walked inside to see my client, and he grabbed me by the arm. He said, wait. I got to tell you something else. I said, what's that? He said, well, I just want you to know on the trip back from the courthouse to the prison, I did something. I said, what'd you do? He said, well, I decided to take an exit, and I took your client to a Wendy's, and I bought him a chocolate milkshake. It's a really silly story, but it speaks to me about how important it is that we stay hopeful. When you begin to accept the narratives that some people can't do this and that situation can't change, you are going to be part of the problem, and changing the hope is essential to changing the world. I wish I could stop here, but there's one more thing I have to tell you. We can't change the world by just getting proximate, just changing narratives and just staying hopeful. The fourth thing we have to do, and this is the hard one, is that we have to do uncomfortable things. Because you do not create justice by only doing what's comfortable and convenient. I've looked, I've studied, I've researched. I've never seen an end to oppression, an end to poverty, an end to abuse, an end to suffering when people only do what's comfortable and convenient. To change the world, to create justice, we have to do uncomfortable things. And that's hard. But I actually believe that we are in a room full of people who know what it means to do uncomfortable things. You cannot create the kind of dazzling things that you've created. You cannot innovate without putting yourselves in uncomfortable situations. You all take risks. You all do difficult things, and you accept that you will not succeed until you do the uncomfortable. And that is why I believe that it is us in this room who are capable of getting proximate, changing narratives and doing hopeful things, and yes, doing uncomfortable things that will ultimately be necessary to change the world. I'll end with this. There is a different metric system for those of us who are trying to change the world, and I just hope you'll think about it. If you're trying to change the world, you can't measure how you're doing by how much money you make, by how many people applaud you, by how many people think what you're doing is great. You're going to get a lot more people who think what you're doing is not so great if you try to intervene on behalf of the abused and the suffering. But there's a different metric system. It was taught to me by an older man. I was in a church, and this older man came into the church, and he was sitting in a wheelchair. I was giving a talk, and he kept staring at me the whole time I was giving my talk. And he had this very stern, almost angry look on his face, and he was distracting me because he was looking at me so intensely. But I got through my talk, and people came up at the end of the talk. They were very nice, but that man kept sitting in the back staring at me. And finally, when everybody else left, he got a little boy to wheel him up the middle aisle of the church to come and talk to me. And this man came up the middle aisle of that church, and he had that very stern look, almost angry look on his face, and he came up the middle aisle, and then he got in front of me, and he put his hand up, and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I didn't know how to respond. I just stood there. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stepped back, and I mumbled something. I don't even remember what I said. And then he asked me one last time. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then this man looked at me. He says, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And this man looked at me, he says, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was so moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know what he was going to do. Then he grabbed me by the jacket, he pulled me into the wheelchair, he said, "Come here, I'm going to show you something." And this older man looked up at me and he turned his head. He said, "You see this scar I have behind my right ear?" He says, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, in 1963, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head and he said, "You see this cut down here at the bottom of my neck?" He said, "I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote." And then he looked at me. He said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man." He said, "People look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." It is the uncomfortable things we do in service of justice that I think ultimately honor us as a human race, as a community of people who are committed to changing the world. I believe really simple things. I believe that no one is their worst act. I think each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. If somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If somebody takes something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. I do believe that the opposite of poverty in this country is not wealth. We talk too much about money. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And ultimately, I believe that we have to judge how we are doing, not just at Zeitgeist, but all over the world, by not looking at how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. I think we have to judge how we're doing by how we treat the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. And it's with that hope that I believe we can get proximate, we can change narratives, we can do some hopeful things, and we can do some uncomfortable things. And I'm excited that you've created space in your day to even consider the possibility. Thank you very, very much. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, thank you.